Well, greetings to all and welcome to IBES. My name is I'm Larry Godry. I'm the Executive Secretary of IBES, and today is day 2 of our online conference, which is dedicated to the topic of transformative change. We have given ourselves 3 days to start thinking about transformative change as the plenary of IBES asked us to do, with a view to initiating down the road a future assessment report on that topic. So it's very early days, we call it pre-scoping, and during this pre-scoping we start unpacking the topic. Yesterday we had a very good first day, very lively. I started by introducing IBES, a little bit what the achievements of the first work program were. We talked in particular about the global assessment and how well received it has been, some of its impact. We also then introduced the second work program. IBES calls it its work program up to 2030, and in particular the 3 topics that this work program will start focusing upon, one of those being transformative change. And I then handed over to our speaker for day 1, Kai Chan, who is a professor at UCB, the University of British Columbia, and Kai presented on transformative change as a system change in general, and he also explained also what the global assessment had been doing, in particular in its chapter 5. Then there was a discussion for about an hour and a half or so about transformative change, people asking what kind of a system change would be needed, asking how quickly those changes could be achieved, in what type of context, by what type of actors. So there were many questions. So it's of course a very rich and new topic for IBES, and since it was the first conversation, it was very broad. And we then indicated that we would be opening a forum for written contributions, which is open until next Wednesday, and we will do that for today's conversation as well. And this forum has been very active all night with people exchanging, and that's the idea, so that's very good, and we are capturing all of that. So today we intend to proceed in the same manner by having an introduction to a topic related to this conversation on transformative change. Today, we will focus on what to change. We will be talking about leverage points. Our speaker, whom I'm going to introduce in a second, will tell us about places potentially to intervene, and where one or several small changes could actually trigger and generate bigger changes in other factors. This is what we are going to focus upon today. What I'm showing here now on the screen is only one slide, which I would like to share this afternoon as an introduction to this topic. And this is a slide on process, which shows our journey towards the transformative change assessment. It starts now and today. And so what we're doing with this process, which again we call pre-scoping, is to collect input from all of you, from a large diversity of stakeholders who are quite numerous today, so that's very nice to see. We also were numerous yesterday, and we would expect in particular that you propose questions that the future assessment would address regarding transformative change. Then the next step will be a scoping meeting in April of next year. Of course, a scoping meeting has to invite necessarily a small amount of participants, and there is currently an open call for nominations of experts and it's almost closed. It closes on the 15th of October, but there is still an opportunity to apply, and all of the input collected over these 3 days would then be summarized and channeled into that scoping meeting as an input, and that meeting would then be in charge of producing a roadmap for the assessment, which we call a scoping report, including an outline of the chapter, a few bullet points on what each one of the chapter would contain. It would also involve considerations regarding organization, timeline, budget. All of this would then be considered by IBES 8 in February 2021, with a view for it to be approved, and then for the assessment to be initiated, and the assessment would then start immediately after IBES 8, and it is currently envisaged that it would go over 3 years. So that is it for the process. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, who is also going to moderate this short discussion. This is Dr. Laura Pereira, and Laura is at 3 places at once, so she's a very busy person. She's at the Center for Food Policy at the City University of London. She's at the Stockholm Resilience Center at the Stockholm University, and she's also related to the Center for Complex Systems in Transition, which really is at the heart of the issue today at the Stellenbosch University in South Africa. And Laura, your fields of research are related in particular to food systems, adaptive governance, transformation, social ecological systems and resilience, and innovation and futures. And you're also well versed when it comes to IBES matters. You've been in particular a member of the task force on scenarios and models, the previous one. You are a member of the new one, which is just starting with the second work program of IBES, and you were also a lead author on the African regional assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services. So with that background, we can only succeed this afternoon. And so I will give the floor to you, and then we'll be back shortly after that. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm just going to share my screen to start off the presentation. And just wanted to start off by saying good morning, afternoon, good evening to everyone joining us from around the world. I'm very excited to be able to talk to this aspect of this pre-scoping call, really around what to change when we talk about transformative change in the context of IBES, of biodiversity and ecosystem services, and nature's contributions to people. So the general outline of my talk is going to really talk about how we think systemic change actually happens, then referencing this idea of leverage points, which came out in the global assessment, just to talk through a little bit more of some of the theory and the literature, the academic work that's been done in this space, and then talking about, well, how we can think about different ways of enabling transformative change. So there were quite a few topics that emerged from the plenary discussions in Paris earlier in the year on key sort of themes that people thought were going to be quite important when it came to thinking about what it is around systems change that we want to engage with from this perspective. Identifying and looking at and interrogating a bit what we mean by transformative potential. So not just looking at transformations themselves, but how we can actually think about transformations in the future. And then some kickstart questions to help guide and to provoke conversations and discussions for the rest of the afternoon. And I just really appreciate this one quote, which talks about, if you don't change direction, you may actually end up where you're going. And I think that that's exactly the kind of framing to start off this idea of what we mean by transformative change, and this need to definitely move away from business as usual trajectories. So transformative change, when we think about transformative change, kind of the idea is that is a good example, and it's a very Eurocentric one. But if we think of medieval Europe, and then we think about the Industrial Revolution that arguably was actually sparked from, or the existing seeds of the Industrial Revolution were around in medieval Europe, that kind of massive transformation that people wouldn't necessarily have been able to think about or perceive in medieval Europe did actually eventually emerge. And I think that we can arguably talk about sustainability transformations as being a similar complete reconfiguration of how we actually live in the world today. And there are multiple different futures that can open up around that. But that's really what we mean by transformative change. And I think that Kai's reference to systems change yesterday and really systems thinking, it's at that systems level, at the global Earth system level, that we're really talking about trying to reconfigure different dynamics. So how we think change happens in systems, there's a really famous idea around the iceberg model of quite often we just reflect on events, sort of what is happening around us, but actually embedded and underlying those events are patterns of behavior, the actual underlying structures of systems, and then the mental models and the assumptions, beliefs, and values that we have that actually reinforce these system structures. And that's really the leverage points, or the points at which we are able to try and intervene to completely flip and change the system. But there are also other different theories of change. So we can think about top-down processes of change. So something like the Montreal Protocol, which was really important in reconfiguring at the global level, technologies and just the ways that governments, civil society actors, citizens and businesses actually operated. But then you can also think of bottom-up change, sort of revolution, social movements. Wangari Maathai's Green Belt movement, I think, is a very good example of sort of bottom-up change that really had impact not just within Nairobi or Kenya, but on the African continent, and I think arguably around the world. And I really like this idea by Bani Banerjee at Stanford Change Labs of looking at systems acupuncture. So it's not about trying to reconfigure the entire system, but to find those key points within the system that can really relieve tension, I think is the word, and reconfigure and open up for alternatives to emerge. So this is a very complicated diagram that I don't expect everyone necessarily to engage with, but I did want to just talk about the multi-level perspective and social technical transitions as one of the most important theories of how we think change happens within systems. And in essence, it starts from this idea of niche innovations, sort of people doing alternative things very much at the small scale at the local level. But then how this interacts with what we call the regime, sort of the dominant system or way of going about doing things, which is configured by industry and policy and technology and sort of science and culture and markets. And it's how these niche innovations actually interact with this regime that could potentially spark a systems change. We also need to take into account that we have multiple different contexts or landscapes within which these niches and regimes are operating. And that can change in different parts of the world depending on which scale you're actually looking at the problem. So this way of thinking is largely informed the transitions thinking movement. We've also spoken a lot about leverage points as a key way of affecting change within systems. And this goes back to Donella Meadows. And in essence, you can see here a really good diagram that was adapted from Abson at Lufana University, which looks at, you can sort of have a small change in materials, altering material flows, which is relatively easy to do, but it won't necessarily have a massive impact on the system. Changing processes or feedbacks is a little bit more difficult, but could have a greater impact. Looking at how we actually redefine goals or flows of information or organize ourselves is a deeper leverage point, but we don't have that much research in this area, but could be a lot more effective in terms of shifting systems. And then again, the bottom of that iceberg, looking at how we change mindsets and paradigms and the way that we really relate to each other in the world is probably one of the biggest system changes or interventions that can be made, but that is really difficult to do. So from another lens, again, coming from this paper, there are key points that Donella Meadows actually talks to, But sort of starting at the top, these parameters, relatively mechanistic characteristics, for example, subsidies and taxes that we can implement that could have systems that could change systems to a certain extent, but they're quite shallow as leverage points. Then delving into feedbacks, where we're engaging with sort of changing the strength of negative or positive feedback loops. Then looking really at design, which is the social structures and the institutions, how we actually manage these different feedbacks and parameters. And then again, going down to the intent level, looking at the individual level all the way through to sort of society, the underpinning values and goals and worldviews that different actors have. And arguably that's the strongest and deepest leverage point, but also the most difficult to engage with. But also transformative change doesn't just happen at one point in time. So you've got this idea of a leverage point, but actually you don't just kind of suddenly stage an intervention and expect a systems change to happen. There's actually a large temporal aspect and different capacities that are required at different stages to actually try and affect some kind of systems change. And so this is adapted from work by Per Olsen and Carl Folke. I'm looking at how we think of enabling transformative change. So there's a really strong phase around preparing for the transformation. It's looking at those niche and alternative innovations, reconfigurations at sort of much lower levels of the system. That when a window of opportunity or opportunity context arises, that you could then actually sort of start to navigate the transition because you've already prepared some of these alternatives to take the place of the dominant regime. And then it's about building the resilience of that new direction and also recognizing that this is an ongoing process, that you'll then build resilience of that new regime and then probably have some kind of new reconfiguration emerging over time there. So if we kind of combine this temporal way of thinking about transformations with the multi-level perspective from that niche to kind of regime that Giels mentioned, there's this idea that at the micro level, they're isolated small-scale experiments and sort of lived experiences and narratives that are really important when they recombine and reconfigure and interact with each other. That when a sort of a window opportunity emerges at kind of the macro level, that these can be sort of partly institutionalized. And this is where we talk about the importance of also changing narratives. So it's not just about the actual sort of projects or interventions themselves, but how the narratives underlying them can also interact with kind of dominant paradigms or dominant worldviews and start to change some of those. But as you see on the right-hand side of this diagram, that when we talk about consolidating sort of this new regime and building its resilience, that you have three potential pathways. So you could either sort of go up to the top right, where actually this new reconfiguration of actors actually has been successful at engaging or facilitating a transformation, and that they become the new way of doing things. You could also just have capture, where these alternative regimes or different actors are actually captured by the dominant system, and that continues to be business as usual. Quite often we refer to that as greenwashing when we talk about the corporate sphere. Or you could just have a complete collapse of these alternatives, that there's just absolutely no ability for them to survive or actually navigate into the future. So some of the key ways or points or places within systems that we can really start to engage with when we think about some of these deeper leverage points, not just looking at different sort of material flows, is, for example, just thinking about where it is that we want to go. So we have targets and goals at the global level. The IT targets are a good example. The sustainable development goals are kind of these endpoints that we're trying to achieve. But what those actually palpably mean, the visions and the narratives that inform what success would look like, is still currently largely lacking. And in particular, recognizing the diverse pathways of actually trying to get to those different goals is also something that really needs to be engaged with. So just opening up the fact that there are multiple different pathways across different levels of the global system, and really engaging with what those futures could look like, what some of those pathways are, and opening up some of these alternative narratives that really could inspire people to change their behavior, which is a sort of a key leverage point, is very important. We also need to recognize, and sort of the IPBES value assessment is kind of at the core of this, recognize that we have multiple different values, and that in different spaces, in different contexts, some of these values emerge more strongly than others. So these are images that came about from one of the scenario models when we listed in expert groups exercises, where we were asked to look at what positive nature futures could we think of at the global level. And there were a variety of different values and preferences and things that were important around dynamics and culture and just like different sectors, food, water, etc., that emerged in these discussions. And just recognizing those is really important, and to open up that there are actually a plurality of futures that we need to take into account when we think about transforming towards a more sustainable planet. So this led into the Nature Futures framework that the expert group on scenarios and models has been working on, and which will continue to inform the work going forward, trying to link in with the modeling community and with the ongoing assessment. So I think that this will be an important component of the work that the assessment could take forward, linking in together quite a lot of the work that the groups across IPBES have been doing. We also just need to take into account the context of inequality, and that when we talk about transformative change, these are the kinds of really deep systemic issues that we can't ignore. And sort of there's a deep reality to levels of inequality, to resource use, to what it means, to what well-being actually means in a future world, or what prosperity means. So when you've got figures like the 26 richest people on earth having the same net worth as the poorest half of the world's population, those are really interesting numbers that we really need to start dealing with if we're going to have an effective plan going forward. Then thinking about agency and power, sort of identifying those who do have the agency to change, opening up space for change to happen, this idea of a system entrepreneur that's really about leveraging these different intervention points, empowering more marginalized individuals to actually act for change. This comes back to that plurality and diversity of value systems and just cultures and ways of thinking and doing things, and then enabling a diversity of actors to be able to act for change. So there's an interesting paper just published by Dufresne et al. That looks at kind of conventional places within systems, within financial systems, such as looking at loan markets from banks, at stock exchanges, at stakeholders as really key intervention points that sort of utilizes and leverages where there is agency and power to change to have kind of systemic impact. We also need to, I think, interrogate what we mean by impact, sort of unpacking this notion of scaling, not just about scaling up and getting bigger, but also acknowledging that scaling out and sort of doing things differently in different contexts can also be really important when it comes to transformative change. And then this idea of scaling deep, which is really about changing relationships and values and beliefs, or sort of engaging the hearts and minds of people, which is really talking to what Meadows meant by engaging with intents and paradigms and worldviews. And we need to think about how scaling operates in that kind of way around narratives and worldviews, rather than just, for example, technologies or widgets that can be input into different situations. And then finally, this is just the idea of acknowledging that transformations go into the future, but that we can try and assess or think about what interventions have transformative potential now. And there's a lot of learning that can be done from social innovation. And so as Francis Wesley says, without a historical lens, it's very difficult to understand the particular attributes of interventions that will eventually in the future be transformative. And so she comes up with these these 4 points in a recent book published in 2017, where she talks about innovations needing to contain an aspect of radicality, of being radical. And this really goes to the heart of the need to reconfigure the relationships within social, ecological, or socio-technical systems. That the innovation itself, or the owner of that idea, is actually prepared to make the necessary compromises, to see the idea or the innovation grow and expand or scale in a variety of different ways, and to acknowledge what they call the adjacent possible. So things that are running in parallel, which may not be directly related, but that actually could very much help help move the transformational, the transformative process forward. Also acknowledging sort of being very opportunistic about what kind of change needs to happen at what different levels, across from the earlier stage all the way through to the end, and engaging in broader institutional structures, that system entrepreneurship aspect of recognizing values and laws, routines and policies that also need to be shifted in order for that transformation or that transformative change to happen. And then sort of acknowledging that there needs to be pushback from the system, or that there's going to be conflict with the dominant regime, with the status quo, and how you can actually manage that conflict. And the idea is that if you don't have pushback from the system, then you probably aren't engaging in transformative change. And within that, there's a need to tolerate paradoxes. We're all still humans that hold paradoxes as individuals. And sort of when you start to bring multiple actors together to actually think about change, that being able to tolerate and acknowledge those paradoxes is important. And also recognizing that there are unexpected or unintended consequences of any intervention in a complex system. We say that every innovation actually has a shadow that comes with it, and making those explicit and acknowledging them is extremely important. So I wanted to finish off with the reality check of the current trajectory we've seen over the past year. This movement sparked by Greta Thunberg and other activists around Fridays for the Future, the youth movement around climate, Extinction Rebellion, just really emphasizing sort of the dire state of the trajectory that we're currently on, which I think also acknowledges that we just haven't done enough. We've got these goals, we've got these targets, but the reality is very far from where we actually want to be in the future. And so I think this is why it's such a timely point to actually have an organization or a group like IPBES being able to think about this notion of transformative change and what it will actually take to get towards the future that we agree as a planet we need to move towards. And so here are some of the kickstart questions that I had, and this was particularly rather than questions about transformations per se, but the sorts of questions that an assessment might be able to try and actually get an answer, which is about what are the plural desired futures that we have for biodiversity, ecosystem services, and nature's contributions to people. Who has the agency to affect transformative change, and what actions can diverse actors, not just sort of one set of potentially political or scientific actors, take to enable these changes? What are the seeds of change that have transformative potential that could lead to these futures? What are the equity implications of transformative change, recognizing the winners and losers in this space? Identifying if there are potentially global ecosystem intervention hotspots without which transformative change won't actually be possible if we don't actually engage in these spaces. And then really unpacking what the values are that underpin current development trajectories, and how these can potentially be shifted to become more sustainable. So those are some questions, some food for thought, and I look forward to the engagement for the rest of the afternoon.